Good morning, and can I welcome everybody to the 13th meeting of the Education and Culture Committee in 2014. Can I remind all those present that electronic devices should be switched off at all times because they do interfere with the broadcasting system. Our first item today is to continue taking oral evidence on the Historic Environment Scotland Bill. In March we heard from the Historic Scotland, RCAMS and the Scottish Government Bill team. Next week we'll be in Orkney for a fact-finding visit when we'll meet a range of people involved in the management of the historic environment there. But today our evidence session has 4 panel members. Can I welcome today Councillor Harry McGuigan from COSLA, Kate Maver from the National Trust for Scotland, Dr Simon Gilmore from the Built Environment Forum Scotland, and Alexander Hay from the Historic Houses Association Scotland. Can I thank all of you for your written submissions, which have been very interesting. And we're going to move straight to questions from members. I can ask members to indicate when they wish to come in. But can I start the questions this morning, if you don't mind, by asking the panel effectively about the issue of clarity around the role of the proposed body Historic Environment Scotland. A number of witnesses in the written evidence we've received seem to suggest that there seems to be a bit of confusion, shall we say, around exactly what the practical role of the body would be. Do you share that confusion, and do you believe that there's a shared understanding of what, for example, the term lead body actually means in practical terms? Can I start with you, Harry?
Yeah, I don't know about the shared understanding. That is very much a kind of subjective consideration, quite honestly. But I certainly do feel that we're moving in the right direction, that there is, if you like, a collaborative spirit behind this, and I think that's a big step forward. The devil is in the detail and will be in the detail. At the moment, it's very broad in general terms that are being used, but good work is being done. We're certainly comfortable, but guarded to some extent, and will be vigilant in order to make sure that the collaborative working does become a reality, and we start to see some mainstreaming in that, as opposed to us all sitting in our own wee trenches and doing our own little bit. Hope that helps, Chair.
Thank you. Kate?
Well, thank you, Chair. The clarity, the problem with the clarity is the conflict of interest that exists within the different roles of the new organisation, because I think we're all clear that we want to give more emphasis to the importance of the historic environment. We all want to collaborate, as Harry said, as a sector, and we therefore welcome the advent of a strategy. But inherent in that, in the structure of the new organisation, are conflicts of interest which we think haven't been resolved, and we've been quite open about the reasons we are worried about those. And the particular one would be the role of the regulator. We think that while there are bodies throughout the sector, both private, public, and also charities that can cover most of the activities that you'd expect in this area, the one organisation that can certainly make the biggest difference is the current Historic Scotland as a regulator. And if you then have a body that's both a regulator and it's operating heritage visitor attractions, and it's giving grants, and it's supposed to be responsible for maintaining properties, then there is an inherent conflict of interest in that. And we think that if you've got a lot of properties to maintain, and you've got to bring visitors in, and you've got to keep the business going to fundraise for yourself, there's a danger that the regulator bit doesn't get the attention it would need because it's a smaller part.
If it helps, I know members have got specific questions on conflict of interest, which we'll get to later on, so I know we'll go into that in some detail.
Okay, so in terms of clarity, I think that there is a bit of a muddied perception about all those things coming together.
Okay, thank you. Simon?
Yeah, I recognise the need for clarity. BEF's, in their response, highlighted this issue, certainly, because by necessity, the bill lays out the functions of this organisation in very general terms. There are many other organisations out there in the historic environment who do some of these things. So, for example, protecting and managing the historic environment, local authorities have very, very clear and very, very important role to play there as well. And we would like to seek real clarity over what the role of the new organisation will be relative to local authorities in that respect. The other areas, learning about and educating others about the historic environment. There are third sector bodies such as Archaeology Scotland which undertake those roles as well, and they do similar sorts of roles. And we wouldn't want to see this new body somehow taking over, doing what other organisations already do and do very, very well. We were just talking before we came in about various projects which encourage community involvement. Adopt a Monument is one of them that Archaeology Scotland runs, who's a BEFS member. And we would be keen to see clarity, or at least some reassurance, that this new organisation, this new body, wouldn't be sort of trespassing into those sorts of areas, and it would be very much an enabling body, which allows things to happen and encourages others to take things forward, rather than trying to wrap them up in its own thing. So I think that's where our issue with regard to clarity of functions lies. It's about, yes, we accept that the actual bill has to be very general, which allows this organisation to go forward and do the best for the historic environment. But at the same time, we'd like to receive some reassurances somewhere, either in the policy memorandum or others, that other areas, that it wasn't going to trespass and stand on other people's toes.
Okay, thank you. Alexander.
I think the HHA are reasonably happy that as to what the purpose of the merged body is. I'd back up Kate very much on how it's going to work in practice, and I think that's all I would have to say on that.
Okay, thank you. None of you mentioned lead body. I mean, I think one of the questions that's certainly come up in some of the written evidence is that the question of whether there's a shared understanding of what the term lead body actually means in practice. What is the practical implications of Historic Environment Scotland being the lead body? What does that mean? What does it do in terms of its operation on the ground? Is that clear enough? Have you got a clear view of what lead body actually means? I mean, I think Dr Gilmore talked about local authorities' role, particularly here, and also in terms of some of the evidence we saw, the amount of properties and the environment that's controlled by, for example, Historic Scotland versus the totality. So is the Historic Environment Scotland as a lead body, does that have a practical purpose? Dr Gilmore.
For that, yes, we certainly see it from BEFS. We accept that there is a requirement for a champion, so to speak, a lead body, which allows us all to come in and work through the strategy. But this is a new organisation being created to help lead that strategy. And we do need an organisation to take that forward. Now, if we weren't merging the Royal Commission and Historic Scotland, we would expect one of those two bodies, or if not both of them, jointly to help take that forward. And there are other major organisations out there, such as the National Trust, and I'm sure that Kate can speak to that much better than I can, which would also have lead roles in certain areas. There's no doubt about that. But a lead body with regard to these sort of general functions and ensuring that everyone can take the betterment of the historic environment forward is actually a very positive thing. And actually, with regard to the merger, there is currently still a confusion even in professional eyes with regard to the respective roles of the Royal Commission and Historic Scotland. And the merger of those two organisations into one organisation will hopefully remove that confusion, the confusion in terms of their roles, and it would actually help us to focus much better on taking forward those aspects that are very, very good in this strategy for the betterment of the historic environment. I don't know if that answers it, but yeah, I mean, we certainly recognise it.
Thank you. Harry.
Leadership requires an understanding of those that you are leading. So it's important that we don't end up with identifying a lead body as being some kind of authoritative body that directs and requires of its followers or its members. We have to be careful about that, because sometimes people would interpret the lead aspect in almost a kind of Stalinist role. It certainly should not be that.
I would hope Stalinism would not be a part of the principles underlying the new body.
It wasn't directed at you personally, Stuart.
Well, I appreciate the clarity, Councillor McGuigan. Thank you very much for that. I'm going. Sorry, Kate.
To add that I think one of the really important roles of a lead body is that it does invest in the research that allows us to understand better the historic environment, that it has the resources there to do that, and to keep a central archive of things that matter to the Scottish historic environment, as ARCAMS does, and that it promotes that so that people can go to that body for information to help them understand their environment, and that you know, going back to its regulatory role, that it is somewhere that keeps a check on people, putting things before the preservation of the historic environment, and that there's a right of appeal to it if local people feel that things are going against them in terms of the protection of what they care about in their historical environment. So that lead role of where you turn to when you need advice, information, perspective, a champion, those are the sort of things that are valuable in having a lead body.
Okay, thank you.
Both Simon and Kate have used the very important word champion, and I think from the private owner's perspective, that's what we would certainly like the new body to be. We have found on the whole that Historic Scotland have in the past been very supportive of the private sector, and we'd very much like that to continue.
Okay, thank you. Liam MacArthur.
Following up your line of questioning in terms of the lead body, we've obviously had evidence from a wide range of stakeholders, including the Association of Local Government Archaeology Officers, who pick up this point about the lead role and the clarity around it, particularly in relation to the kind of advisory capacity that Historic Scotland and perhaps ARCAMS have had to date, and whether there is a risk in referring to a lead body that the advisory nature of that relationship may be misunderstood, and that local authorities may find themselves under more pressure to simply take that advice as kind of beyond question. It has a priority in terms of the scheme of things. Is that something that you could see requiring to be clarified in more detail within the bill, or is there a level of understanding of how that operates at the moment which would give confidence that it is perhaps not a concern that should trouble us unduly?
I think local authorities are working very hard at the moment to try and make sure that we get a sensible understanding, you know, across the working arrangements, not just from the local authority point of view and Historic Environment Scotland point of view, but from the voluntary sector, third sector, private sector and so on. We have got to make sure that this is about, if you like, a coherent approach being adopted by the individual members and the individual, don't mean individual, but individual agencies that are there. We certainly are anxious to see that kind of co-production becoming a reality, and sometimes in the past that hasn't been the case, you know, that we can find ourselves pulling in opposite directions. That's unhelpful and unlikely to secure the kind of protection and promotion of the historic environment that we all want to see.
I mean, that's helpful, though. I think it probably illustrates the point that where there is an agreement about the approach that should be taken, obviously the advisory role that the new body would play is simply going to reinforce that, and that's extremely helpful. But where there is expertise amongst the archaeological officers within a local authority, which is at variance with that coming from the new body, is there a risk that by setting up one as the lead body under the legislation, but the other that has kind of lead authority in that area, that we have a conflict there that's going to be more difficult to manage than perhaps it is at the moment?
No, I don't think that conflict should necessarily arise. I'd be very concerned if that were to be the case, because that's what we're trying to avoid. I think it's important, certainly from the local government point of view, it's important that we understand how best to use the resources and the expertise that is there locally, that understands the locality, that understands what the strengths are, the weaknesses are, the resources that are there, to do things. That doesn't mean to say that they have some prerogative on wisdom as far as that is concerned, but they have a heavy input to come forward with. And I don't think we should speculate that you're going to have this adversarial approach. I don't think it's that'll happen. I hope
I'm not suggesting there will be an adversarial approach, but there will be areas, I would imagine, where there are differences of opinion, perhaps on the means of achieving a shared objective. But I think what I'm trying to establish is whether or not the way in which the bill is set up may make managing that relationship more problematic. On the one hand, you have, as you say, the local authority, which has responsibility, has a more kind of maybe nuanced understanding of how a particular site or monument or whatever fits within the local environment, but which is receiving advice from Historic Environment Scotland, which is slightly at variance in terms of management issues, and how is that settled when you have one as a lead body under the legislation, the other which has the lead in managing that particular site or that particular monument? Don't know.
Perhaps I could help answer that. I personally feel that, and I'm going to alienate all my Historic Scotland friends now, that right now you've got a worse situation than you would have in the new body set up, because local authorities will look to the advice being given to them from Historic Scotland, for example, as coming directly from Scottish Government, from ministers, because it's an agency, whereas what you're actually doing here is you're setting up an independent NDPB, and its advice and experience and knowledge will be coming from an independent source rather than from Scottish Government itself. So actually, in my mind, it's more likely that local authorities will not take the advice of this new body to the same importance as it would currently take advice from Historic Scotland, simply from the way that you've actually set up the advice-giving body. Having said that, we in BEF certainly think that there is potential in the bill to be more explicit with regard to the relationship between this new body and local authorities. It should perhaps say in the bill somewhere that there is an advisory capacity there for this new body to give advice and support local authorities in the jobs that they do, the crucial jobs that they do, be they archaeological or conservation officer jobs. So we think that there's there is potential to explore that a bit further in the actual wording of the bill. But in terms of whether local authorities would take this advice to heart more or less than it does currently, my own particular feeling is it would probably take it less to heart than it would currently.
Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Convener. I wonder if I could ask what impact the number of local authorities who have cultural trusts will have in these areas where some local authorities still have direct control over the historic environment in terms of their responsibilities, but some have set up trusts to look after these, and if that actually, you envisage that might complicate things, or is there an opportunity for better communication, just to gauge your opinion on this?
It's a very, very good observation to make, and it is something that I would share the concerns about that, to make sure that we have a clear understanding about what these arm's length organisations are doing, and that they dovetail in with what the local government position is in relation to the new body. I wouldn't envisage, I certainly would be determined to make sure that we did not allow a situation to develop where there was a kind of negative effect coming about, because of the arm's length. But I don't really see that as being something that worries me at the moment. But we have to be alert to it.
Anybody else have any views on that? Nope.
Just to say that there are various models of delivering this expertise out there already, and trusts are only one of them. Commercial companies provide advice to local authorities in some circumstances as well, especially for archaeological advice. So I think, you know, however we describe the relationship between this new body and the local authorities, we have to find a wording which actually does include however those local authorities are getting their advice, if you see what I mean. I know that's going to be difficult, but I do have to write it. That's fine.
Thank you very much. Liz Smith.
Could I possibly ask about the question of the lines of accountability when it comes to the strategy? When we took evidence at a previous meeting with Historic Scotland with Arkhams, there seemed to be a little bit of confusion as to exactly who is accountable when it comes to the strategy for the new body. Could you make any comment on that?
I can certainly throw in tuppence worth. The strategy itself is a co-production, so it was brought together not just by government but by lots of other organisations and individuals collaborating to bring out the sort of ideas in this. With regard to ultimate responsibility for this, the way I see it happening, and I don't know whether this is exactly the same as everyone else, but is that we have a three-tier system of governance, and that tries to bring together everyone to pull together in the same direction. Now, in doing that, each individual part of the of that board of governance and indeed of the wider sector will be trying to desperately, hopefully, to deliver on the actual strategy. So we'll each be responsible for our own part, if you see what I mean. So government has its role to play, certainly through HES and the Historic Environment Policy Unit, and they will be presumably being monitored and taken to task through its corporate plan and so on and so forth with regard to delivering on the strategy themselves. The NTS will be looking to try and deliver the best benefits and so on as well, and will have responsibility itself through its own trustees to try and deliver those. The Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, for whom I work, for example, will be trying to deliver aspects of the strategy and will be ensuring that we monitor our own progress and things on that.
Yeah. I think that's very helpful, Dr. Gilman, in terms of the individual responsibilities within that. What I'm driving at is the overall responsibility for the strategy. As you say, government has a role to play. The new trustees of the new body will have a role to play. How do you see all that coming together in terms of, let's say there was a problem with the strategy. How does that get worked through? Whose final responsibility is it to decide on the overall strategy?
The governing board that will be pulled together will have ultimate responsibility for that, which will be chaired by the Cabinet Secretary. But that board will incorporate other members of the sector in it. So that board will be given the task of ensuring that we deliver on the strategy. But in that respect, I can't see anything in the strategy yet that I could disagree with. It's not a disagreeable strategy. So I think what you would end up with, all you're looking at is potentially disagreements as to how potentially you might deliver certain aspects of that strategy. But those issues are issues that we deal with every day in the sector, and what we've managed to do through this and through a lot more collaboration over recent years is help each other work through those issues and try and get to a positive end point rather than getting stuck on the negative ones.
I think Councillor McGugan said rightly at the start that everybody's relatively comfortable and a lot of things in this look extremely good. We've obviously had to oversee the mergers of other bodies in the past where the overall strategic direction has not been clear and there has been difficulties in that. And so I would be more comfortable if I felt that there was an absolute clarity about who has the overall responsibility and decision-making power, particularly with government involved on an arm's length basis. If that means that the government sets an overall direction for culture policy, then we need to be comfortable that the trustees and those groups who have been participating in putting the strategy together are very much singing from the same hymn sheet. Would you accept that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we all are actually, for the first time in a long time, singing from the same hymn sheet and are pulling together. I find it difficult to think how else we can actually do this, bringing co-production, if that's what the new buzzword, to into reality in the historic environment without government somehow relinquishing some control. I mean, you know, either you have it that everyone contributes and they build it and it's taken forward and it's sort of almost a sort of ground up approach, or you have it as diktat coming down from on top, and that's what Scottish Government wants, and so on and so forth. And it's very difficult to find that balance. But I think we are getting towards that here.
Yeah.
And so
No, I think that's right in terms of the actual production of the strategy, where I think a first-class job has been done by pulling the sector together. It's about the delivery that I'm interested in, and if we do happen to encounter any difficulties, which we've obviously had in other bodies where things have not worked out, where that line of responsibility actually lies. I think that's a bit of a concern.
An observation on that. Single outcome agreements are an excellent example of how we can ensure that there is a clearly understood agenda and strategy that is being followed by the partners to the single outcome agreement. That is the community planning partnership locally. If that starts to go awry, then we should all be concerned about that. Both local authorities, CPP members, and one of the good things about some of the legislation that's coming out is that there will be a mandatory expectation on some of the CPP partners. It won't simply be the local authority who is tied to that. But that will be the opportunity to review and to challenge if there is failure on the part of any of the agencies that are involved in the working group that drew up the strategy and will be responsible for monitoring the progress and oversight of that strategy. And I think, you know, we've got to have confidence in that. You know, the governance, you know, is about Scottish Government, local government, and UK Government working in a concerted, sensible way. Sometimes it doesn't always work the way in which it should, but it should be seeking to find ways and means of taking the spirit of the single outcome agreements and making sure that happens. Now, there will be situations where difficulties do arise and you get stubbornness on the parts of certain of those agencies. But if the arguments are strong enough and persuasive enough and intelligent enough, then I think that, you know, that's the way to move forward.
Thank you.
I think it's difficult to say at this point. To Cantwell, we don't actually have any outcomes as yet under this strategy. As Simon has said, it's in motherhood and apple pie in a way. We're all very proud of it and it says good things, but in terms of deliverables, outcomes, timescales, in terms of who's going to be on a board that would oversee that, and I think that's the right answer in terms of who's accountable, would be the board, who are yet to be determined. But if you're going to set objectives and outcomes and then expect people to be accountable, you need to make sure that the funds are available for those outcomes to be delivered, and it's not clear yet where that money would come from, how it would be distributed. I mean, as has been said, we'd all love to say, yes, we want this is the world we'd like to deliver, but everything that needs to be delivered has to be financed, and unless the money is, you know, clearly available for particular things, we've all got, as individual organisations, our own priorities to deliver, and I'm accountable as Chief Executive of the National Trust for Scotland to the trustees of the National Trust of Scotland. We have our own strategy and our own plan, and I'm delivering that for the trustees and the members. If they align, if the strategy aligns with that, and I can deliver both, I will. But if I get to a point where the new board said, we want the National Trust of Scotland to do this, and that's not what my own trustees have declared as our own intent, then that is a potential conflict. And it's not a conflict I see, because our charitable objective is to conserve and promote heritage, so it's unlikely that it's not going to be aligned. But it's a very good question that you ask, because if you're going to hold people accountable, you need to give them the resources they need to deliver.
Okay, thank you. Jane Baxter.
I just would like to ask Mr Hay whether he thinks the strategy gives sufficient cognizance to the role of the private sector given the amount of properties that are owned privately in Scotland.
I think it was our concern about the original document that there wasn't enough stress laid on the importance of the private owner within the historic environment, because we do have the majority of houses are still in private hands, and we would certainly like to stress what the contribution is that it makes to their local economies. The thing I do try to stress is what good value the country gets out of the private ownership, because we maintain these at our own expense. There's very little public money available to the private owner. Some of them are in private charitable trusts, and they do have access to outside funds, but very little is now available. The historic Scotland budget doesn't really extend very far, and the provisos that are instilled on owners who wish to apply for private for their funds are really quite severe. I have said before at various meetings before that I don't believe that they are geared to the private owner any longer, and I have had a little trouble with HS who disagree with me, but it's very hard for the private owner to undertake to do certain things which usually the application does reply. Sorry, I'm wandering a little from the point here, but I think I certainly would like to stress what a great contribution the private houses make to their local areas, and conditions are tough all round, and we do use our houses for business, most of them now. And the general public access that is required is very difficult to deliver in the current environment in Scotland, because there are certain centres which attract visitors, and but my part of the world, which is the Scottish borders, the season is very short, and it's very hard to attract general day visitors sufficient to justify the costs of opening.
Okay. Are you hopeful that that situation might improve?
I think we accept that the situation is as it is. I don't really see that the bill in itself will make any difference to that. But we certainly feel that that the way forward is to remain in the private hands. One of the important things is to retain control of the setting of today's houses, and we are quite concerned about the move on land reform. I know that's nothing to do with you here, as to the way it is heading, because it does there's a lot of militating against private ownership of land, and that extends further as well to whether private ownership is a good thing or not. But that's another committee, so it worries.
Rather, we didn't get into land reform in this committee, if you don't mind. Can I just, you said right at the start of your original answer there to Jane Baxter that you had concerns, I think you said concerns about the original document, about whether it recognised the important role of private owners. Have your concerns been in any way answered?
I think it doesn't specifically mention the private owners as much as perhaps we would like. There is nothing in there, as Simon said, there's nothing we can object to. It's actually, it says all the right things, but I wonder whether it can deliver in the face of conflicting political pressures.
You should always have high ambition, though, Mr.
Yes.
Thank you much. Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. Let me just start by declaring interest in that I'm a member of both the National Trust and Historic Scotland. A number of submissions we've received have indicated that they feel that the term historic environment should actually be defined in the bill. And I'd like to quote just a couple of submissions here, one from the Institute of Conservation, which refers to the historic environment of Scotland as being the tangible and intangible culture, and another one from Scottish Environment Link considers that the natural and historic environment are in a large measure one and the same thing. And this seems to be open up a huge remit. Do we have a problem? Do we need definition of that terminology?
Eight definitions that run the risk of restricting what we're able to do as opposed to being able to enhance what we're able to do.
I would add that we've certainly said in our consultation response that, yeah, we think there should be a definition in the bill of the historic environment. And our feeling is it should be the definition which is in the strategy, which is, if I can read it out, Scotland's historic environment is the physical evidence for human activity that connects people with place, linked with associations we can see, feel and understand. Now, yes, that's including the intangible as well as the tangible, but it very clearly puts the emphasis on the physical evidence for human activity, which again does actually help to draw boundaries which previously there may not have been, and certainly that overlap with the so-called natural environment and the cultural environment is one of those.
I think you'll find also that SNH has a definition when it was formed of what the natural environment is, and it's an analogous situation where you've got a new body that's responsible for natural heritage. What defines natural heritage is written into their founding documents in a way that we think it should be here as well, for clarity.
I suppose I always think of it, Historic Scotland and so on, as being responsible for more the built environment. We always think about historic houses and so forth. You don't think about broadening it out into more intangible culture. How do you draw a boundary around that? How do you get a definition, whether it's in the bill itself or as part of the strategic document? How do you get a definition in there that will ensure there's no encroachment across into other areas?
Well, already they have inventories, don't they? I mean, there's an inventory of battlefields, there's an inventory of design landscapes, there's an inventory of historic gardens. I mean, there are already definitions and descriptions and inventories of things that aren't buildings. So it's design landscapes. I mean, there's the physical evidence of the human hand. The battlefields are, in some cases, not really anything other than a field, but the stories around them and the significance to people locally of knowing what happened there is enough to make that a historic environment with not a building to be seen.
Are there really any negative implications of not having it in the bill itself and having it as part of the strategy document?
I would argue that it should be in the bill as well as in the strategy document, that this definition should be in there. We have various reasons for saying that. One is simply to explain, perhaps, the actual name of the bill itself. It's Historic Environment Scotland Bill, so what does the historic environment actually mean? It'd be useful to have it in the bill to help explain that. It would help us in terms of our advocacy role as well, in terms of we can actually point to something which says, well, this is what the historic environment is, and it's very important. I don't think that we should get too hung up on whether or not the definition encroaches into other areas. Real life is messy. The historic environment is messy. It includes vast swathes of the so-called natural environment, because our Scottish natural environment is basically created by human hand. There are very few areas which are actually really, truly natural and have never been touched by human hand or affected by human hand. So we have to expect that there will be some messiness there. And again, we wouldn't want an organisation, a new organisation certainly, to become a silo for just simply dealing with one thing and have blinkers and not really look around itself and see where it actually links up with all these other areas. That's not just the natural environment, it's health, it's education, it's all these other areas as well.
But do you think there's a potential here, as I touched on before, for confusion between who's responsible for what?
I think there's less confusion than there is currently with regard to who's responsible for what between the two bodies that they currently exist. And I think that going forward, the definition of of how people or how various organisations funded from the public purse deal with certain areas and where the buck stops will actually be borne out in activity and collaboration going forward. I mean, that's what we all want. We don't want all the different organisations to be doing very, very different things in their own silos. We want them to be collaborating much more and moving forward further. So, no, I think that that the emphasis here on the physical evidence for human activity really does help to pinpoint what this organisation is going to be trying to do.
You made the point that we live in a sort of a messy environment, and there's change happening all the time. Would it? I'm just trying to think of the logic here. Would it be better if the definition was in the strategy document, which can be updated and changed as time goes on, rather than embedded in the bill, where you'd have to go for primary legislation for every tweak and change?
Can I just say another thing about attempting to define everything here? I think that does get extremely messy, extremely confusing. You did mention, and I'd been discussing it outside with my colleagues here, the historic environment. We tend to think of buildings and but the historic environment is being managed very, very sensibly by owners of land, by local authorities, the tremendous amount of work to maintain the scenic environment in our localities and give people. I went for a walk yesterday morning and I thoroughly enjoyed it, just looking at the areas that I visited as a child, down at the waterfall and having a look at that. And that's something that's very, very important to enrich our communities. And as you say, that's the attention needs to be paid to that. And that's why I'm saying that you have to be careful about making a definition about the strategy here. We could write chapter after chapter in terms of what we expect the strategy to be doing. But I think it's to be more broad-based than that. But it's got to be this co-production, collaborative working, and not too regimented around the buildings aspect.
I just wanted to make the further point that it's really important in terms of strategic environment planning systems. There's no mention at the moment of how the historic environment strategy would mesh with the local planning and the strategic environment planning. And what would be helpful is it became, as part of the normal planning cycle, that you had to take into account any historic environmental features, so that this is all, as you say, is more of a holistic view, and it's not just looking at it through a narrow lens. So we would want to see that would be something that would be joined up rather than kept separate.
Final question, Colin.
I realise that you're not lawyers, so I don't think so. Is there any, to your knowledge, legal disadvantage in having the term defined as part of the strategy as opposed to the bill itself? Is there any disadvantage in that?
You're quite right. Not a lawyer. So whether there's a legal disadvantage or not is probably out with my purview. But we certainly see that there would be an advantage in it being in the bill, as opposed to just being in the strategy. We think that the actual definition as it stands currently came about through many hours of blood, sweat and tears in a collaborative venture, but it is sufficiently broad that it could stand the test of time. I can't think that it couldn't do that. But also in terms of having it in the bill through in a legal sense, it becomes a useful and powerful tool for ensuring the legitimacy of the historic environment in other discussions with regard to cross-cutting policy and management of natural environment or education or health and well-being and so on and so forth. It gives you a much more powerful tool to be able to point to in legal documents and say, no, it does exist, this is what it is, and we need to deal with it.
Yeah, I just think it's a question of equality, because if you've got under SNH a definition of the natural environment, and then you've got under Historic Environment Scotland no definition, then if you've got cross-cutting areas such as landscape policy, then already there's there's an unevenness there. And I think it's about consistency. And I think if you looked at the SNH definitions and you were doing landscape policy, you'd want to see equal weight given to the two definitions just for clarity and demarcation.
Okay, thank you. Can I just push you a little bit on this area? I think it's an important area. Now, Dr. Gilmore, you talked about the definition that's in the strategy document, and you then went on to talk about how broad that was, all-encompassing, and therefore would hopefully avoid any future changes that might be necessary if you produced a tighter definition. But isn't that the fundamental difficulty here? That if you have a very broad definition, then effectively it loses any legal authority that it has. And the ability to be legally binding requires a tight definition. And the fact is that the strategy has a broad definition. It's wide and woolly for good purpose and for good reason, but it doesn't work in terms of putting that definition in on the face of primary legislation.
In response to that, again, I don't have any legal expertise, so I couldn't tell you whether or not you could legitimately put this into legalese, so to speak. But and I wish I could remember off the top of my head, I don't know whether Kate has it, what the definition is in the document for SNH, because I'm fairly sure that must be very broad and all-encompassing to encompass the entire of the natural environment of Scotland and put that into legislation. So I don't see any particular difficulty that way, no.
Well, I don't have, now do I have a copy of that in front of me either, but I'm sure we'll look that up, whether that such a definition is in the Act or whether it's in some other place. The second point, though, I wanted to put to you, I'll come to your second, Harry, but I mean, the second point I wanted to put to you was you talked about we have to make sure that it covers other functions such as education, etc., etc. You named a few. But the bill on page 1, part 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then probably a bit of 6 and 7 in that as well. But basically 1 to 5 there, part 1, 2 of the bill, lists all the general functions and specific functions, the particular functions, the conservative, enhancing, the educating, the interpreting, the understanding, the identifying, the recording, etc., etc. Isn't that what you mentioned, they're already all listed in the bill?
The general functions that the organisation will undertake are comprehensively listed in the bill, certainly. But in terms of how this organisation then interacts with other bodies, public funded bodies such as SNH and others, isn't in this, except in very general terms that it shall work with other persons, whether in partnership or otherwise, and so on and so forth. So I think that the concept we're trying to get towards is that putting the definition into the legislation will allow this body to say, well, these are the areas that we're interested in, what about you? And how do we work with you over there, doing your bit of it with regard to the natural environment, or indeed with the National Trust, who have both cultural heritage properties, archaeological sites, and the natural environment to look after as well, how the organisation moves forward with them and so on. But it gives them a much clearer definition as to, well, we're interested in this, and we understand that some of that overlaps with some of what you're doing and so on. How do we then move forward in collaboration with that? Yes, you can work, you can say that learning about and educating others about the historic environment is there as a function. But again, it says learning about and educating others about the historic environment. It never defines what the historic environment is. It just is.
Well, we know what it is, the definition's in the strategy.
It's in the strategy, but it's not in the legal document that actually people will be taking forward in any legal case. So, you know, the legal case would have to then look at a strategy, which is not a legal document at all, and as Liz has already pointed out, has potential difficulties in delivery and attribution of where the buck stops and so on. There is no complications such as that in the bill itself. It is very clear where the buck stops with regard to that.
What happens, though, in terms, and this is my final question on this point to you, but what happens when we change our view of what the historic environment is? If you have a definition which has to be legally binding, it has to be, in my view, pretty tight. If then you put that in the bill, a tight definition, and let's take a historical example. We used to think of the industrial heritage around us not as part of the historic environment. Things like mines and mills and factories and all these things were not considered part of the historic environment. It was much more about landscapes and ancient monuments and castles and private houses and lots of other things. But the modern industrial heritage was not seen in that way. But we've changed our view. If you have a definition which has to be tight and legally binding in the face of a bill, then we sometime down the line change our view about what the historic environment is. Isn't that the point that Mr Beattie was trying to get to, I think, where effectively you then have to come back and change the primary legislation to account for that change in our view of the historic environment, rather than having a definition which is in the strategy and a bill which is separate?
Well, the simple answer to that is yes. You may have to come back and look at the primary legislation again in due course. But how long do you think that might be? I mean, that would be 50, 100 years hence. Maybe it would be time to actually look at that legislation in any case, because other aspects of it certainly will be out of date by that point in time. If you take an example of, what would the future historic environment look like? Well, moon bases. The material remains of human activity on other planets, the human activity under the sea, and so on and so forth, that we currently already have a provision to deal with. Those things weren't considered when we initially set up the Ancient Monuments Act, certainly. But I can only assume that the Scotland's historic environment is the physical evidence for human activity. That's fairly broad to me, and I can't think of a way we'd have to come back and try and rethink that particular statement.
Okay, thank you. Councillor McGuigan, sorry, you wanted to come in.
I think I said at the start of this that you have to be careful about definitions. Definitions can be very, very exact things. You can define what velocity is or what mass is, and everyone agrees with that definition. Once you start to move into the kind of social domain, the community domain, that doesn't happen. It's not easy to define, and you can end up excluding rather than including. So I'd be very guarded about saying we can have. I know that Claire understands about definitions because I taught her that in a school, and velocity and mass. But no, I make the point that be careful about definitions. Definitions sometimes, especially in the social domain, they tie your hands and they limit what you get from it. Thanks, Stuart.
Yeah. It's not essential that you declare that you used to teach members of the committee. I'm not sure that's particularly relevant, and I'm not sure helpful to some members. Can I move on now to a question now from Mary Scanlon?
Convener, given that the words Stalinism and diktat have been used this morning, my questions are along the lines of the charitable status for Historic Environment Scotland and its impact on other bodies, and hopefully moving to a more democratic, fair and inclusive system. Can I just start with the Historic Houses Association? I note that the bulk of Scotland's built heritage is in the independent ownership, and the cost to the Scottish people is little or no public expense. And the same submission raises a cause for concern, and I quote, "There is potential for tension as Historic Environment Scotland will be an owner of significant heritage assets, a tourist operator and a regulator." Sorry. So my first question is really about the submissions mentioning close links with the Scottish Government, perception of a lack of equity, the independent sector could feel squeezed by taxpayer-backed charitable body, and NTS, your concerns as a state body with both secure taxpayer funding as well as privileged access to government ministers and government departments. There is a risk that the state charity doesn't operate at a level playing field and squeezes out the voluntary sector. I felt I had to read that because it's your words, not mine. So I really just wonder if you could elaborate on those concerns, particularly NTS and the historic houses.
I might let Kate start off first.
Okay.
They're more worried about it than we are.
Okay.
Yeah, well, all of us who work in the voluntary sector compete for funds, so that's nothing new for us, and we're comfortable with the concept of competing for funds. But one of the things that's particularly striking is that if you think about the cuts in government funding to Historic Scotland and ARCAMS together, over the recent past, it amounts to about £15 million worth of cuts. Now, the overall pot for the historic environment, charities working in that sector, we estimate to be worth about 26 million. So if we've got to find another 15 million for Historic Scotland and RCAMS out of that 26 million, that doesn't leave an awful lot for us. Now, these are all back of the envelope calculations, you understand, but there is a limited amount of money to go round. We accept that there's a squeeze on public finances and therefore more money has to be found. But what is very challenging for us is a notion that we would be competing for funds with a body that was advantaged by being still very closely related to government, that would have access, as you say, to government ministers, government departments, that because of the notion of properties and care still being owned by ministers, the huge backlog that we all have in terms of conservation, or the gutters that need cleared, the roofs that need fixed, all the things in our care which are constantly needing maintained. And we've assessed our own backlog at the moment to be needing £46 million spent on it on the next 10 years. Now that's something that we are working with. We've got 10 years to find an extra 46 million over and above what we already spend. And because we take seriously looking after the assets in our care, we will find that money and we'll work hard to get it. Now, what we don't want to do, though, is be up against somebody who doesn't have to worry about the backlog. All they have to do is to keep the visitors coming and earn the money to maintain their things as they have at the moment, when we've got the whole backlog of years and years of maintenance and repair to catch up on. And it seems to me that the amount of money, that the equivalent amount of money that Historic Scotland has to find has not been quantified. So if it's staying with the taxpayer as a liability to keep up and maintain the buildings, that needs to be explicit, that needs to be visible, it needs to be addressed. How's that money going to be raised? Who's going to meet those obligations? And particularly as so many of the properties in the care of the Scottish ministers don't actually belong to the Scottish ministers, but belong to other people who haven't been consulted about what we see as a change of contract. If they're going to be managed now by a new body, then those people who own those properties ought to be consulted and ought to be made aware that of who's going to maintain and conserve them, which is what the original contract was for the properties and guardianship. So these are areas that we've raised this over the past 18 months now. We still feel unclear about the accountability for maintaining the properties in the care of the Scottish Minister to the level that was the commitment made when they were passed into guardianship. That's not clear who's going to pay that money. And if it's not the new body that has to pay any of it, then we think it's a very unlevel playing field, and we are not happy about that as an organisation that has to raise most of its money on its own.
Thanks, Kate. I would support everything that Kate has said. We are very aware that the Westminster government has done exactly the same with English Heritage, but they have quantified an amount of money that they are going to give them to cover the backlog of their repairs, and have said there is going to be no more money. The HHA in London don't believe that this is anywhere near enough money to cover their backlog. The HHA have carried out a survey of its members recently, and as we've publicised before, the backlog of urgent repairs, that is the things that need to be dealt with quickly within our members in Scotland, is £57 million and growing. A lot of this obviously has to be funded either out of private funds or from income generated from the properties themselves. Now, we are concerned that if Historic Scotland and their new guys are expected to break even and make money out of their properties, I believe it's true that only 4 of the HS properties currently show a surplus, which is shows that the rest are actually having a deficit. So they are going to have to increase their footfall in their properties. We are worried that this will, the advertising, the promotion will concentrate very much on their properties. We have discussions with Historic Scotland in the past, and they have undertaken that they're going to try and grow the sector. And we are involved with them and the National Trust in the Heritage Tourism Group with a view to promoting this. But we are concerned that if we can't grow the sector, then Historic Scotland will try to increase the footfall in their own properties. Many of our houses carry out weddings at the moment. A lot of the Historic Scotland properties are going down that route. In fact, virtually every place now has the ability to carry out weddings. We started doing that over 20 years ago, and there was hardly a soul doing it, and almost had the market to ourselves. Now it's very competitive even amongst our own members for that sort of business. But it is a concern for the future that as to where all our visitors are going to come from.
I think that's a note of considerable concern between you. We've got 103 million of a backlog of urgent and other repairs. Can I just say to Kate Mavor that your back of the envelope calculations are the same as what I have in front of me, and that's Historic Scotland in the last 5 years has gone down from 51.7 million to 37.8, and RCAM is down from 5.8 2006-7 to 4.5, so both reducing. So my
to clarify, the figures we have are NTS's figures. They're not.
Okay.
They don't come from anywhere else. They're just reproduced from NTS.
So it's the same back of the envelope figures that we're all looking at.
On the public record, the reduction in funds, I mean, they're ours, but we got them from the public record, so they're not made up.
Okay.
The 26 million pot is more of a back of the envelope, but those other two figures are firm figures.
So the reduction from 51 to 37 is an accurate figure?
I believe so.
Yeah. And your backlog is 46 for National Trust and 57 million and growing from historic houses. That's 103 million. So can I just ask, we're obviously just at stage one of this bill. What reassurances are you looking from the Scottish Government to ensure that you won't be squeezed out of charitable funding? What reassurances are you looking for that some assistance may come your way to deal with this backlog, to ensure that Scotland has the natural historic heritage that it needs? And what should we be doing in this bill? Where are the changes that would need to be made in this bill to ensure that the backlog and the historic environment that you've both outlined aren't squeezed out for future?
Well, I think what we're looking for is an explicit commitment in the bill to working collaboratively. I think that you could have one organisation going out hell for leather to soak up all the visitor attraction money that's available, or you could have everybody being committed to working collaboratively so that anything that was very obviously predatory was not permitted under the legislation. You could also have protections built into the legislation that people have a level playing field, that any tax advantages, for example, that you might have as being formerly a government body would be taken away, so that you were competing on an even keel. And in particular, there's one HRMC one whereby, as a member of the National Trust, you are not allowed to get a discount in our cafe because you've already had a certain amount of discount as a member under Oscar's rules. That doesn't apply if you're a member of Historic Scotland, so you can go to Historic Scotland and get an extra advantage. Now, once the body floats off, we'd like to see that if it does apply for charitable status, there's no special dispensation given to it. That's just one example. So it's the level playing field, the writing the protections in that a body that's taxpayer funded is to work collaboratively, and that the protection of grant funding is explicit as well, so that if it's a grant-giving body, a certain amount of its grant, or even all of its grant in its grant funding capacity, goes out with the Historic Environment Scotland itself, because it gets its own grant and therefore it shouldn't be fishing in the grant pool. Those are the sort of protections that should be built in. The ring fencing for the grant funding, the ring fencing for things like consents, because if it's a fundraising body, there is a risk that funders might try unduly to influence when it comes to consenting. So these are, where I don't know if you wanted to talk about the conflicts of interest in other areas apart from fundraising, but you'll come to that. But those are the things that we think can be written into the bill that will protect against predatory behaviour by an organisation which, let's face it, is going to be, as all of us are, strapped for cash. It's going to have a lot of liabilities. It's going to have its own separate board pressurising the management to look after things, raise money, up the income. So they're going to be under a lot of pressure, and it's going to be quite difficult for them not to want to compete, because it's a small pot that we're all fighting for. And I personally believe that competition can be a good thing, in the sense that it makes you up your game, it makes you efficient, it forces your hand in terms of sharing back office resources and things to keep your costs down. It makes you express yourself more articulately and more clearly in terms of what you want the money for. And I think something like HLF, the Heritage Lottery Fund, has required so much of all of us now competing for funds to think through so carefully what we're trying to achieve and what community benefits we're delivering, and it does sharpen up your focus on what you're really doing, rather than just doing some kind of wishy-washy protection of the historic environment. It's about what's it for, who's it for. So competition can be a good thing, but the level playing field for us is absolutely critical, because otherwise an organisation such as ourselves, which is a sort of community of interest for the benefit of everyone who lives in Scotland, becomes disadvantaged, which just seems plain wrong.
Just final question. Convener, can I just say I would be surprised if a commitment to work collaboratively was written into a bill. In my personal view, that is more of an assumption than something, and I'd be surprised if a commitment to a level playing field was written into the bill. I would hope that would be an assumption. It does seem to me that you have considerable concerns around these 2 points. So can I just finally ask, if 5 years or 10 years down the line you felt that you really were being squeezed out, and you felt that your £103 million of backlog maintenance, urgent and otherwise, and wasn't being addressed, do you see anywhere in the bill where you could lodge an appeal against this new organisation in order to get a level playing field and fair, inclusive and democratic funding?
Well, I think one of the things you have to you have to know if you're going to appeal against a decision is you need data. And I think, as I said earlier on, without understanding how Historic Environment Scotland is going to account for its repair and maintenance bill and what it's prioritising and how it's going about its business, that's very difficult. So one of the things we would ask for is transparency in all its dealings, so that we can actually compare like with like. Alex mentioned that 4 properties in Historic Scotland make money and the rest don't. Well, that's still emerging information, because the way that they're accounted for is different from how we account for things. And I think if it does turn into an NDPB or certainly if it's a charity, that sort of information will be clearer, because that's what you have to declare as a charity. In terms of right of appeal, I mean, we're actually hosting a conference next week about the very subject of how do you decide if there's not enough money to go around, and we're all different people all operating, but we all care about Scotland. Then how do you prioritise the allocation of resources, and what is the mechanism whereby you decide that it's more important to bolster up Edinburgh Castle than it is some small ruinous abbey in the middle of nowhere? And there needs to be some kind of context for that, and that's what we as a National Trust are actually working to, in terms of getting definitions for what's significant, how you prioritise things within a small country such as Scotland, instead of all in your own silos deciding what's most important. I think this is the debate we're trying to have. But in answer to your question, I mean, how you put that into the bill, that's I haven't seen a right of appeal written into the bill. I think that would be helpful. And it comes back to that question of accountability for the historic environment strategy. If the strategy is explicit, as strategy should be, what the prioritisation of resources is, then the accountable body should be able to be where you'd go to for an appeal when you'd say, the strategy says we have to prioritise this, and we feel it's not being prioritised. And that, I suppose, is where your right of appeal would be, to that board overseeing the strategy.
It's very helpful.
Very briefly, if you don't mind.
I was just going to point out that Section 8 of the bill corporate planning area, which is where the organisation will lay out how it's going to achieve its goals and names and so on. That's overseen by by Scottish ministers. So obviously, if Kate had an issue, she could go to her elected officials in Parliament and say, actually, this corporate plan needs to include X, Y, or Z, and there is a potential mechanism there. I have written down to next to Section 8, how does Scottish ministers deal with a rogue Hess? And it's exactly those sort of issues that possibly could be more transparently and more clearly laid out in the corporate planning section of the bill.
Thank you. Gordon MacDonald.
Thanks very much, Convener. And for the record, can I also say that I'm a member of the National Trust and Historic Scotland. I want to continue the discussion we've had on the impact on other bodies. And in the opening remarks, there was a suggestion that there may be a conflict of interest between the role as regulator providing grant aid and as an operator competing with other organisations. Now, given that Historic Scotland currently has total grant expenditure of £15 million, of which roughly 12 million is, according to the annual accounts 2012-13, 12 million goes to historic building repair grants. Is there any evidence of conflict of interest between the current role of Historic Scotland as operator and providing grant assistance?
Looking round for a buck to pass.
I'm trying to think whether anecdotal evidence counts, and I think it probably doesn't. But I mean, I think if you look at some of the big building projects that we've had, I mean, I'm probably not the person to ask because I've not been long in this industry and therefore I don't have a long track record. But there are constantly challenges to us all if we're trying to develop a visitor experience and a visitor attraction. We want to have coaches arrive. Alex just saying before we came in that his arch doesn't accommodate the new kind of coach. So if you're doing if you're trying to get tens of thousands of people coming to your property, then you do have to start thinking about, amending things, adapting things, and that does give you a conflict. I mean, I don't know whether there's been any consents allowed at any of the Historic Scotland properties that wouldn't be allowed to the rest of us. But that's really the pressure people are going to be under, and that's why I think it's important to have that total transparency of any consent that is awarded to any Historic Environment Scotland property and care by Historic Environment Scotland, that it be transparent, so that if people feel there has been some perhaps bending of the rules, then at least we can actually challenge on that. I don't know whether it's been in the past, but there's certainly a risk in the future. And I know that myself because we have these pressures the whole time when we're trying to develop our organisation to be more self-sustaining. Then there are always those judgment calls you have to make. And we have our debates with Historic Scotland about our particular challenges, but it would be difficult to debate it with yourself.
Mr Hay, you said in your opening remarks that Historic Scotland were very supportive of the private sector. If I've not taken it out of context, would that not suggest that there hasn't been any conflict there in handing out grants?
I haven't been aware of, and no one has told me that they've had problems with them. When I'm talking to Historic Scotland and having meetings with them, they're very keen to incorporate the private sector views. But obviously the experience of individual members, I'm reliant on them telling me. Historic Scotland used to have a reputation of being, should we say, obstructive in their listed building planning consents. No, you can't. The previous chief executive said she was very keen that they would become more enabling and helping people to do it. And I've stood up at various meetings and asked if anyone had had an experience of dealing with Historic Scotland where things had not changed, let me know. And they haven't done so. So I'm assuming that things are more helpful. Certainly the one area which I know we've had some difficulty with is and I mentioned it earlier, the setting of the historic house, particularly where the land is not in the ownership of the house itself, and what the owners consider to be inappropriate development is applied for in the close proximity. And Historic Scotland have, in a number of occasions, been quite supportive of trying to get this overturned, but this was only an advisory situation, and the local authority didn't have to take account of it. I think the Historic Scotland have been supportive in that context.
Thanks very much. Remaining on the financial numbers, there was a suggestion that there had been £15 million worth of cuts in the sector across ARCAMS and Historic Scotland. Is it not the case that in the 3 years up to March 2013, both ARCAMS and Historic Scotland have actually generated a surplus in 2 out of those 3 years? And of the year to March 2013, where they actually made a deficit, it was only a deficit of 225,000. So why do you think there would be a need, if they're working within the current financial envelope they have to work in, why do you think there's a need that they would have to reclaw back £15 million?
As I said before, the way that the accounts work in the public sector are different, and therefore when you're talking about surpluses and deficits, when I have a surplus, it's because I've covered off all my repairs and maintenance and all the ongoing stuff before I even start talking what's left over. And if you're not accounting for that in the same way, I don't know whether those figures are right, I'm not familiar with them, but certainly of the 129 properties in our care, only 12 of them wash their own face. So all the rest of them have a deficit every year, and that's the deficit that we've got to try and find the funding to cover. And that's before you start talking about the backlog. So I'm very surprised if there's a healthy surplus amongst the estate of Historic Scotland, if it was accounted for in the same way that we account for it. And I think that's one of the advantages, were there to be charitable status, if there would be, you'd be comparing apples with apples instead of apples with pears.
On the subject of charitable status, and I understand it will be up to Historic Environment Scotland to make the decision whether it applies for charitable status or not, but are there any financial benefits for an organisation of going down the charitable status route that wouldn't impact on other bodies' income?
There would be some in terms of business rates. You know, you'd have more favourable rates, which wouldn't affect the rest of us. You would be able to do certain things. Effectively, where it affects the rest of us is when you then start applying to charitable trusts and foundations and other sources of money that are not the public purse, which currently is not. I mean, there's a small amount of that going on at the moment, but it's not really a very important part of Historic Scotland's funding. For us, it's vital, and for most of us in the sector, it's, you know, our main source of income. So if somebody else is coming to fish in the same pond, we obviously feel nervous, and we'd love the pond to be made bigger so everybody gets their fair share. But that's a wish that everybody would have. But in this current climate, it seems to me unlikely, because trusts and foundations and charitable sources of money are still contracting.
Yeah. Basically, the financial memorandum is suggesting that between the gift aid scheme and charitable rates relief, over a period of time there could be a £20 million benefit to the new organisation, which would not impact on any other organisation, because this would be on their current income levels, etc., and the rates relief, etc. But the other thing I wanted to ask you about income is ARCAMS currently is a charity, and I understand that it gets most of its money from its charitable activities. If the new organisation didn't become a charitable, would that income that ARCAMS currently gets from charitable incomes, would that not basically be a loss to the sector, or do you see that being picked up elsewhere?
Saying that if they weren't a charity anymore, things that were being given to them as donations
from charitable activities, they wouldn't be able to get, would they?
No, they wouldn't. No.
So that would effectively represent a substantial loss to the sector. I mean, my understanding is ARCAM's currently getting the region of £5 million a year from charitable activities. So if they didn't have charitable status, they would actually lose £5 million, which would probably need to be made up from the public purse, which would mean there'd be less money for other organisations.
Possibly. I don't know. It sounds feasible.
Could I perhaps say something about that? Sorry. some of that charitable activity, for example, comes through SCRAN, which is the key issue here with regard to the organisation becoming charitable or not, with regard to its own charitable activities. And indeed, of course, SCRAN has its own board of trustees, and they could choose to take that venture and host it elsewhere, for example. And so therefore, I don't think they would lose, the sector wouldn't lose that money. It could go and work with the National Library of Scotland, for example. And so the sector would still retain the income that comes through that charitable organisation. It just wouldn't come through HES anymore.
One quick supplementary.
It was when Kate Maver was talking about the way in which decisions are taken about whether you fund in one area and perhaps not in another. We've had concerns raised about the likely implications for staffing of the creation of the new organisation and the loss of expertise. I think it was the corollary was made with what's happened south of the border. I'm not sure there's necessarily anything we can do with the bill, but is that a concern that you recognise, and what the implications of that might be?
I think my understanding is that was recognised as having been an unintended consequence in the south, and therefore my understanding is that has been mitigated, and that is not something that people would worry about, because what the Commission does and its very valuable role has been written into the new organisation, so that that's right, Simon, isn't it? That they wouldn't be lost, which is we're very pleased about. And it's just worth saying there's been very widespread and deep consultation about this, and I think it's the better for it, because we're not going to walk down, make the same mistakes there. But the comparisons are sometimes a bit invidious, because something like English heritage, which is the equivalent in the south, is so much smaller in relation to the whole historic environment sector in England and Wales compared to Historic Scotland's huge presence here in Scotland, so it's not quite analogous. But I do think that the supposed mistakes that they made with the Royal Commission in England have been mitigated in what's been proposed here, so that's not something that concerns us.
Thanks. Okay, thank you. Just a small question for myself before we move on to the final section. You mentioned earlier some concern about the conflict of interests on the basis of things like the organisation would be receiving money, be giving grants, it would be involved in regulation, etc. These were the areas you covered. What's your specific concern here? Because Historic Scotland pretty much does these things already. So what's the difference?
The main difference is the pressure the organisation is going to be under to raise its own funds and to make its own money, which skews things differently from how it is now. Because if you look at all the staffing there's going to be under this new body, and how many of them are going to be involved in managing tourism outlets, heritage tourism properties, and there's a disproportionate amount of emphasis on that part of the business, if you like, leaving a small amount left to cover the regulatory function. And as I said at the beginning, it's the regulatory function which is really the unique and most important thing that the body does, because no one else does it. And yet they're going to have so many people tied up in trying to run the estate and run it as what they originally described as being a sort of leading tourism operation in the first the draft documentation for this bill. And if there's going to be the emphasis on that and the pressure to find the money to pay for their staffing and pay for all the things which previously were just given money for, then that's the big difference. That's why it's different from now, because the pressure might mean that there will be temptations to perhaps put less resource into proper scrutiny of regulation, perhaps bend the rules a bit in terms of regulating in relation to themselves. As I said before, consents having to be decided upon when they're funders in the background deciding whether to give them money or not. All these things can be mitigated. I think it can comfortably be done, provided everything is transparent and that monies are ring-fenced for things like regulations, so that the people aren't tempted there to use the money that they've got for investing in their own estate rather than regulation.
Yeah, that's quite a serious allegation, that this body would effectively be tempted, I'll put it no stronger than that, tempted to effectively bend regulation, break the law.
I wouldn't describe it as an allegation. I would describe it as if you think it through, it would be under a lot of pressure. So it's important that in establishing it, that there's a commitment made to transparency to avoid that happening. There's no allegation intended. It's just trying to anticipate how difficult it would be to put time and effort into regulation when you're under pressure to, fix the roof and open the doors and cover your health and safety and all the compliance requirements that are necessary if you're going to be opening to the public. There's a lot of pressure on that, and that's why you have to safeguard it.
I don't think MDs would be have a different opinion about making sure that it was open and transparent and they were safeguarding all that was legal and proper in terms of the process. I'm just slightly concerned that there's an overemphasis on some difference that between what the bodies currently do and what they will do under the new setup, which frankly I'm not sure is there. I mean, clearly the policy aims in terms of the government documents published, for example, in regulation, it talks about the fact that these powers in terms of in relation to the historic environment, designation and regulation in the wider planning system will effectively be transferred from to Historic Environment Scotland, from Historic Scotland and ARCAM. So effectively we're talking about a transfer of existing powers that they currently operate under to a new body. So we're not really talking here about new powers or different powers or in some way creating a body which I genuinely don't see where the concern is that they would be under such pressure that they would be likely to be tempted, as I said earlier, to play fast and loose with the rules.
Well, I would just point out that both in England and in Wales, who faced similar choices, they both decided not to put the regulatory role in with the management of the properties care for that reason, and they've both given reasons which suggest it's a conflict that might cause problems down the line.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Neil Bibby.
Yeah, thanks. Is it just following up from that? Is your issue not that the new organisation would play fast and loose with the rules, but it could play fast and loose with the rules? Okay.
It's not that, of course it wouldn't. I mean, I don't know anybody who would think to do it deliberately. I'm just saying that they could, and therefore the protection has to be put in, because when people are under pressure, and who knows who's going to be their chairman and who's going to be their board, and what emphasis that the board of a separate body is going to put on what elements, it's a public protection that needs to be written in.
Can I just ask you for some clarity on the issue of liability from your written evidence? As we know, the bill will transfer responsibility of 344 historic properties, and you've said in your written evidence the liability for the maintenance of these properties, both those owned and in guardianship, will remain with ministers. However, later on you've gone on to say the liability remaining with the owners and ministers. I just wondered if you could give us clarity on who will have the ultimate liability, because out of the 344 properties, I know that the Scottish Government only owns 74 out of the 344.
I think the point that we're trying to make here is that our understanding is that the liability remains with the ministers, and we've verified that with the policy unit. But what our point is that if the various owners that there are who've given their properties into guardianship of the Scottish ministers have in so doing some kind of contractual arrangement with the Scottish ministers. And our contention is that if Scottish ministers then outsource the management of those properties to someone else, which is the new body, then at the very least the owners should be consulted. But what we're concerned about is if they're not transferring at the same time the responsibility to maintain those properties to an acceptable level in terms of conservation, but rather keeping that responsibility to themselves, then how can the original owners be sure that somebody is going to manage and conserve those properties as was originally intended, because it's no longer going to be a bill met by the taxpayer. As I said earlier on in the meeting, that it's not clear who's going to meet that bill, because they're taking over the management of properties and care, but is it written down the standard to which they must be maintained, and has the consent been sought by the original owner to make that transfer? And I think there's a disagreement between ourselves and the policy unit as to whether there needs to be some consent given or not. But that's really the point we are trying to make. We think that all the actual owners of the properties that are in guardianship of the Scottish Minister should be consulted, and it should be made clear who's responsible for the management to a certain level and how it's going to be paid for, because, as I said, the cost of it all has not been quantified.
As things stand in terms of the bill, though, in the are we to be sure that the liability for the maintenance of these properties, both those owned and in guardianship, will remain with the ministers? Is that...
Sorry, I didn't catch what your question was.
In terms of just absolute clarity, in terms of liability for the management of, or the maintenance, sorry, of the properties, that will remain with ministers?
Yeah, as I understand it, yes.
Okay.
Because the ownership isn't transferring.
Yeah. And can I ask you also in terms of just to go back to the issue of the backlog, are the Scottish Government aware of your concerns over the maintenance backlog? Have you contacted them about that, and have they given any commitments, or are there any plans to undertake an audit to ascertain the amount of backlog repairs that are required?
Yeah, and to your first point, yes, they're aware. We've had very, very good conversations and open and regular conversations over this this bill, and we're very grateful for that consultation. They are aware of it, and as I understand it, currently Historic Scotland has an exercise underway to begin to quantify what that bill will be, what that cost will be.
Okay, can I thank you all very much for coming along this morning at a very interesting evidence session, and very helpful for our deliberations in relation to stage 1 of the bill. And can I suspend the meeting briefly to allow the witnesses leave? Our next item today is to consider 2 petitions. We will deal with them one at a time. The first petition, PE 1487, was lodged by Mark Gordon and the Scottish Secular Society. It calls for the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to amend the Education Scotland Act 1980 by making religious observance in public schools an opt-in activity rather than an opt-out one. Members will note the Scottish Government's view on the petition, which is submitted to the Public Petitions Committee. The Government believes that the current legislation and guidance around religious observance is relevant and up-to-date, and is not persuaded that a move to an opt-in system would be helpful to young learners. In addition, we have received a number of submissions for your consideration. You will have received those papers. And can I just throw it open to members to express any views, comments or actions that they would wish to take in relation to petition number 1487. Mary.
I would like to make a public announcement. Okay. I support the government. You won't hear it very often, but there you are. I support the government. Can I just say, Convener, I have read this through. I do think the government's approach to this case is reasonable. The only thing that I could perhaps add is that I'm not entirely sure that every parent is fully aware of the guidance. In the briefing we've got, the right should always be made known to parents and their wishes respected. Parents should be provided with sufficient information on which to base a decision. So I'm not entirely sure that every parent, when their child starts school or whatever, is given that advice, you know, whether they wish to opt out. And I would perhaps suggest that the Scottish Government may wish to remind local authorities that this is included in guidance given to every parent at a school, and that's all I would add to that.
Okay, thank you very much. Other members? Liam?
Mary's suggestion there in terms of the availability of information. I'm bound to say that I think even armed with that information, I think the experience of parents in different parts of the country can vary significantly. That said, I think the steps that the Petitions Committee has already gone through are probably those that, under normal circumstances, we would probably have recommended doing. So at this stage, I'm not entirely sure where further we take this.
Okay. I mean, I kind of agree with both of the members who have spoken thus far. I think the Public Petitions Committee should put on record that they have taken both, I believe, oral and written evidence and have obviously written to the government. The government has written back laying out its position. Those are the kind of things we certainly would have undertaken had they not already been undertaken, but they have been. I would agree with Mary, however. To me, this comes down to an issue of knowledge about your rights. And I agree. I think, Liam, you just said there, you're not sure that parents and perhaps even young people themselves are aware of their rights in regard to this particular position. And I think the idea that Mary suggested, I think, is that if I'm right here, Mary, you were suggesting that we effectively write to the government and ask them to inform local authorities or promote to local authorities to ensure that parents are made aware of this right.
Yes, I think to promote the information to parents and make sure that parents are armed with this information.
At the moment, of course, it's a legal requirement to include information in the school handbook about the right to withdraw from religious observance, and I'm sure local authorities do that. I suppose the issue that we're looking at or we're discussing at the moment is whether or not parents are aware of that, or whether that's a proactive providing of information, or whether it's perhaps a little bit hidden from parents and young people that they have that particular right. Any other views, Liam?
On that point, and I think referring back to what I was alluding to earlier, the issue of what the implications of that might be if a parent or an individual child elected to be withdrawn from that aspect of the school activity, what the implications of that would be may not necessarily be all that clear, or may be clear in some instances, but not in others. I'm not sure whether that is covered in the code that schools are required to observe, but I think it would certainly be helpful, because I think knowing your right is one thing, knowing what the implications of exercising that right may be, I think is equally important.
Can I just clarify, are you talking about in terms of the sort of meaningful activity that the individual pupil would then undertake?
Or how a school might be expected to respect that right. I mean, I know, for example, in schools I've had a direct personal involvement with, rather than exclude an individual child, they'll find a different way of delivering a particular activity, and so I suspect it would be more illustrative rather than didactic, but it would be useful information in terms of parents or children knowing whether or not and how they might go about exercising the right they have.
Yeah, I think we've got a couple of points. I mean, I think, first of all, can I just try and break this down a little bit? Are members content that we, in the first instance, certainly write to the government and encouraging them to inform local authorities, or encouraging local authorities to ensure that parents are aware of this right? Is that, I think, Mary's suggestion? Are members content we do that? And we also include in that letter the suggestion that Liam's made about going beyond that, about the implications of that and the meaningful activity or otherwise that individual pupils would then undertake. I think that's Liam's point. the letter should include that as well. Yep. So we're agreed that we'll do that. I think it now comes down to, in terms of what we do about the petition, we have a number of options. Obviously, we could take further evidence, we could write out, we could consult, we could ask the government for a further response, we could close the petition. There are a number of options that we have. What are members' views? You must have a view.
I think, as Liam MacArthur said, that considerable amount of work has been done on this petition. The weakness, if there is a weakness, is in the guidance, making sure people are fully informed. I personally don't see any benefit from taking any further evidence which would only duplicate the excellent work, in my view, of the Public Petitions Committee. So I suppose in that sense I'm suggesting that the petition be closed at this stage.
I agree with Mary.
I agree with the government.
That's twice, Mary. That's twice you've agreed.
I don't see what we can add to the work that's already been done, so I think it's reasonable to close the petition.
Well, the only other thing I would say, I mean, from a personal point of view, is that I certainly feel that probably parents are unaware, in the most part, that they have this right, and certainly young people, I'm sure, are unaware of this right to. And for me, it's a matter of choice, a matter of free choice that the individual can make to either attend or not attend. And therefore, I think it's important that, and I'd want to lay emphasis on this, it's important that individual families are aware of this this legal right that they have. I'm less concerned about the law in this case. I think, as long as the option's available to families and individuals to choose whether to attend or not attend, it's important that they're aware of that right. So that would be my priority in this case. I do agree that certainly the Public Petitions Committee has done all of the steps, or carried out all the steps we would carry out, so I'm not sure what else we could add. So I would agree with Mary and I think others that probably at this stage we should write to those who have submitted the petition saying that we are closing the petition. But I suppose the other thing that they could do, as well as us writing to the government, urging them to do, the individual petitioners certainly could urge COSLA and individual local authorities to ensure that parents are aware of this right. That's certainly something they could do themselves. Are members content with that proposal? Yep. Okay, thank you very much. Then we will close the petition and write on that basis. Can I move on to the second petition? The second petition is PE 1498, which was lodged by Colin Emerson on behalf of the Edinburgh Secular Society. It calls for the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to bring forward legislative proposals to repeal Section 124 of the Local Government Scotland Act 1973, as amended by Section 31 of the Local Government etc. Scotland Act 1994. Again, members will note the Scottish Government's view, which is that it supports the involvement of religious representatives in the decision-making process by councils in relation to education, and do not have any plans to change the existing provisions. Can I also highlight, I'm sure members are aware of this, but I will highlight it for the record, that a draft Members' Bill proposal, which is on the subject of the petition, has been lodged by John Finney, MSP. Therefore, do members have views on what, if any, further action we would wish to take on PE 1498? Liam.
I think you've pointed to it in your introduction. I mean, I think if John Finney has a Members' Bill under consultation and consideration, that would seem the logical vehicle for members across the parties to contribute and ultimately to take a view on this. So I'm not entirely sure what more we would add, in that it's a petition urging the Scottish Government to bring forward legislative proposals. We've got a mechanism for doing that through John Finney's bill.
Mary?
I actually feel that the information that I have here is probably insufficient to make this decision. I haven't had an opportunity, convener, to discuss this within my party group, but I think within my party group there's certainly a wide range of views, and I would think, to be fair to all parties, there's quite a wide range of views on this issue. This is historic, it's over 100 years old. I would actually welcome the wider consultation that would be carried out as part of John Finney's bill. I would be very interested to get that wider range of views, And I think rather than us jumping to a decision today, in my view, with a lack of consultation and a lack of information, I would prefer to more thoroughly look and examine the evidence that comes from John Finney. It may, should this come forward as a member's bill, convener, it could potentially be a free vote within my party, I don't know. And these are the, I think, important issues that I haven't had an opportunity to discuss. So I'd be happy to wait for John Finney's bill that would give us an opportunity to look at a wider consultation and a wider range of views on this issue.
Any other members wish to call in?
And for the second time, I agree with Mary.
It's a strange day. I mean, from my own point of view, I think this is an interesting proposal in this petition. Clearly, religious groups have I hesitate to use the word privileged position, but they have a position which is different from other groups in terms of education committees and local government. There are historical reasons why that has been the case. Clearly, that's we all understand that process. But I do tend to agree with the comments that have just been made that effectively, if the draft members' bill proposal by John Finney, if that comes forward, then that would provide certainly a wide platform for detailed discussion and debate on the evidence both for and against such a proposal. And I think that would be the best place to have the debate, rather than us repeat again what the Public Petitions Committee has already done. Urging the Scottish Government would achieve nothing, given the Scottish Government's already expressed its view on this, so I don't think we would serve any purpose there. So again, getting the feeling, I think, for members' views, are members content that we close the petition on the basis that we've just discussed, write to the petitioners, and I'm sure they're already aware of John Finney's proposal, in saying that our belief is that that's the best place to have the debate and the discussion on this proposal, and that's the reason why we've taken this decision. The members agreed? We're agreed. Thank you. That concludes our business today, and I close the meeting. Thank you very much.